This is our final lecture for Module 3. This is Module 3D. We're going to be talking a little bit about ethnicity, race, and segregation in the United States primarily. I also be introducing... Okay, we're going to try that again. Okay, welcome to Module 3D. This is the last of our lectures for Module 3. Briefly, I'm going to be introducing issues of ethnicity, race, and segregation. I'm going to focus kind of as a case study on the United States, although we will look at some factors in terms of migration and source areas for the rest of the Americas. So let's get started. The first thing we need to kind of accept is that what we've talked about so far is European Amerindian populations in the Americas. And one of the things that we've left out is the incredible influence of the African culture into the Americas. And again, this is largely related to forced migration due to the slave trade. The slave trade was largely introduced into the Americas by the Portuguese, although the Spanish, the British all got into the economy and dramatically influenced both the decimation of West African populations and the replacement of the genocide of Amerindians by a slave labor population of Africans. So what we're going to do is talk about a little bit about slavery in the Americas, quickly an overview of emancipation throughout the region. In the United States, then we're going to talk a little bit about what's called the Great Migration, and then contemporary migration trends. In the end, then, I will also introduce your quick write assignment, and we'll be looking at the question of segregation in the United States. Okay, so first of all, the slave trade. What we mean when we say that is a period of time essentially between the 1850s and really the early 1600s, in which the populations of West Africa, from as far south as Angola largely, and the Senegambia, what is today Senegal and Gambia, large populations were forcibly removed and transported into the Americas as a slave population. This transformation largely was following the loss of the slave population that was available to the Spanish and Portuguese under the occupations. I'm going to start this whole thing again. Okay, so welcome to Module 3D. We're going to be talking about ethnicity, race, and to some degree segregation in the Americas. We're going to be using the United States as a case study for contemporary ethnicity and race. In this end of the module, what we'll be talking about is how slavery came to be in the Americas, the influence of African culture as a result of that, the transformation of the landscapes due to emancipation, the Great Migration following the end of slavery in the United States, and then excuse me, contemporary migration trends a little bit, and I'm going to be introducing your quick write map assignment. Okay, so let's begin with the issue of slavery. In the Americas, as we've already seen, the indigenous population was decimated by the arrival of the Iberian conquest, that is Spain and Portugal, and to some degree later by the British and French occupations in North America. One of the important aspects that we have to understand is that early colonization included forced labor and slavery by the Amerindian population. So the Spanish and the Portuguese both actively used indigenous populations as slave labor in mines and to some degree in agricultural production. Throughout the Caribbean, that is certainly the case. That didn't work. The decline of the populations due to disease and due to active uprisings made this an untenable source of labor. So early in the 1600s, and in fact there's some evidence late into the 1500s, the Portuguese began transporting slaves from West Africa into South America, into Brazil initially. Today, often in the United States, we think about how important the African American culture is, and We often talk and consider the issue of slavery in the United States, but what we have to remember is that the slavery in the United States, while it is a significant legacy, it was a relatively small portion of the slave trade. If you look at this map, what you'll notice is that if you combine the slave transports to the West Indies and to South America, that accounts for almost 85% of all of the population transported during this period. And again, this period essentially runs from the early part of 1600s into the middle of the 1800s. And so a 250-year period, by some estimates, well over 10 million people forcibly removed from West Africa and resettled or enslaved in the Americas. Now, when we look at this, what we notice too is that a significant population became part of the Portuguese landscape in Brazil, and the Afro-Brazilian culture is an incredibly vibrant culture. I encourage you to study that, to look into it. It's a fascinating aspect of food and culture in the region. The West African culture also was transported into the Caribbean, extremely strong influence there. This is also why we understand the rimland region of Central America. What you'll notice is that along the east coast of the isthmus, significant aspects of African culture were introduced through slavery along the Belize coast of what is Belize today, and to some degree into the extreme east of Mexico. What you'll also notice, though, is that this significant aspect of slavery came into British North America, much less, almost non-existent in French North America. But slavery played a significant role, and if you'll notice, the origins almost exclusively West Coast, although there was some movement from the East Coast in the Mozambican region today. All right, so slave trade again, essentially as early, by some estimates, as the mid-1500s through the 1870s. Starting in the latter part of the 1700s, essentially with the independence of Haiti in the 1790s, we begin to see the abolition of slavery moving throughout the Americas. And it is somewhat a sad note in American history that slavery and the end of slavery occurred much, much earlier outside of the United States and moved essentially through much of what is Spanish America, the Spanish Americas, very early on. As independence came into the region, so did emancipation. You'll notice in the island arc, most of the emancipation, most of the elimination, abolition of slavery occurred in the 1830s, although again, some significantly later than that. Puerto Rico is one of the last of the Caribbean islands to eliminate slavery. Unfortunately, the latest was Cuba, 1886, and Brazil, the very last, in 1888. But this period of slavery, essentially again from the latter part of the 1500s, early 1600s through the mid-1800s, fundamentally transformed the ethnicity and the cultural landscape of the Americas. Elimination of the Amerindian culture in so many areas was replaced by the introduction of a West African cultural influence in a forced manner through slavery. Now, during the 1800s, one of the things that was also happening is that the African American population began its movement throughout the settled portions of North America. And what the first wave of that is the Underground Railroad movement that occurred largely from the south and moved up, in one aspect, the Mississippi River Basin, a movement of free blacks into the northern states and through the northern states into southern Canada. As a result, the urban centers throughout the north had significantly larger African American populations. It also meant that into cities such as Montreal, into Quebec City, Buffalo, we see this movement of African culture. Now, at the end of the Civil War, we see again, a transformation of American culture. We unfortunately also see the development of strategies during the Restoration period of Jim Crow laws, and as a result, we also see the Great Migration as it became more and more difficult for African Americans to move up economically in the South. There was a rather dramatic outmigration starting in about 1910 and kind of subsiding by the 1970s of significant populations moving from the southern states into northern urban centers. You'll notice during this period extreme transformations in Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia. To a lesser degree, this cross-continental movement, although it's significant, changes in San Francisco culture and Los Angeles culture. During this time, this Great Migration, we also see a flowering of African American urban culture. Significant developments in the arts, in music, in literature. We can see this throughout the North, a real transformation and in fact a strong articulation in its best senses of African American culture with a broader American culture. And of course, one of the main pieces that we often describe in this is the development of jazz. We kind of see the development of jazz and jazz culture in the United States as one of the cultural legacies of the Great Migration. Now, during the same time that we see the transformation of African American culture, we also see radical changes in how migration in general, immigration into the United States, changed through time. And this is an interesting graph. And what I want to point out, this is a graph of percents of migration, or numbers really, of migration over kind of the life history of migrant studies in the United States. So what I want you to notice here is that each of the colors, or the color bands, the thickness of the band indicates the number of individuals migrating into the United States from a given region. And I want to just track a couple of these very quickly. You'll notice here, I'm going to kind of highlight, this is the Irish migration. And you'll notice early on, the 1820s, 1830s, relatively small immigration of any numbers from Western Europe. But then, with the advent of the Great Famine in Ireland, you'll notice extreme expansion of Irish migration. And then again, a slow decline and a narrowing of this band up until about 1930. It almost disappears, and we see just a slight increase recently relative to the other portions. What you'll also notice, though, is that other ethnicities throughout this period become rather significant. You'll notice again, Austria-Hungary no longer exists. Russian migration, you see this dramatic expansion in the 1900s, and then again, World War II years, almost an elimination of migration. And then, in the latter part of the 20th century, early 21st century, you'll notice that a really significant change in where migrants are coming from. You'll notice the significant growth of Mexican migration, as well as Chinese migration, and the Indian migration, South American migrations. All these things are changing through time. Migration has dynamics within the United States. All right, now what I want to do next is introduce your story map project, and we're going to ask the question, such a diverse migration history in the United States, the importance of the African American population, the importance of the Hispanic populations in the United States. How does it look on the landscape? What is its geography? And so what we're going to do next is I want to introduce first the story map that you're going to be using. You're going to be actually using two maps here. The first, let me get this set up to our view, is the ethnicity, race, and segregation map in the United States. When you open this map up, what you're going to see is three layers are going to be turned on. They're going to look like this. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see the entire country. What I want you to look at, we have three layers of data. The first of these, and I'm going to turn the rest of these off, the first layer that I'm going to have you look at is what we call predominant population. Predominant population simply means for a county down to tract level, what is the dominant ethnic group? So let me turn on, again, legend is right here. I'm going to turn that on. And what you'll notice, what predominant population says is by color. Okay, so again, the grays, blues, light blues, dark blues, greens, purples, and reds indicate different ethnic or racial groups. You'll notice that there are three categories: slim, sizable, and predominant. Now when we look at something, we can say a slim gap means that whatever the dominant group is only slightly more dominant than the others. When we say predominant, that means greater than 50% of the gap. In other words, it's 50% more than the next closest ethnic group. So let me just click on an area out here in Illinois, and I'll show you what these kind of look like. When we look at the region, what it's going to be is going to say where you are, and then it's going to give you a pie chart that is a racial breakdown. So in this area, 2010, 63% of the population of Illinois was white, and 14% was black, 15% Hispanic, percent Asian is 4.5, and if I can get this one to come up, the two or more races was 1.4%. So again, that's how we look at a county level. Now what I want you to do, and what I'm going to ask you to do, is look at your area in terms of its makeup. And so what I'm going to do is, I grew up in Kane County, Illinois. And so I'm going to click on that. And what I want you to do is look at, and again, you may look at a county. If you live in a small town, it's going to be a little bit hard to pick it out on here. But what I want you to begin to do is look at your town, your county, your state, and examine the issues of race and ethnicity in that area. One of the points that I want to make, and I'm just going to look at where I grew up, what you'll notice is that the vast majority are predominantly white, and yet you have these clusters in where I grew up of Latin American culture, Hispanic culture. The important idea is not only how race looks, but whether or not you see areas where there are two or more races. In other words, if you see two or more races, that means these are areas where there's lack of dominance. And what you'll notice, at least in this area, is that there aren't areas that are fairly mixed. If I look at this area right here, what you'll notice is that this is a neighborhood that's predominantly Hispanic, and then immediately next to it, it changes to predominantly white. There's not a lot of transition in this area. It's either one race or the other. And what I want you to begin to ask is, all right, what are the implications of that? Are we an integrated society in space, or are we a highly segregated society? Now, the first one you're going to look at is that idea of population. Then, what I want you to also look at is the landscape of North America, United States, in terms of our ancestry. This shows what the population's origins are. And when we look at the legend for this one, what you'll notice is what this is saying is, in terms of predominant categories, and again, when you look at the United States, there are no counties that have a dominant ethnicity in terms of ancestry that is other than European. There's literally no area where that occurs. And so what you'll notice is the colors are listed here, and then the dominance is shown by how dark, again, the color is. And so, for example, if we look across the United States, one of the things that we can see is some areas that are high in one ethnicity, extremely high, and then a lot of areas that are fairly low in terms of the strength of the dominance. Okay, last layer that I'm ask you to look at is languages spoken at home. Now again, this is a contemporary issue that we can look at, and this is a good way of understanding the strength of culture in an area. And so when you see this map, what you're going to see at different levels, and I'm going to turn on our legend again, is that rather than being a shaded area, this shows each of the census tracts and what language is spoken at home. Now, not surprisingly, in the United States, you're going to see across this a strong area that is English only. but you're going to see other areas. And what I want you to do is look at where those other areas are. And I have a couple questions in terms of how that landscape looks. This is a very dense data set, so please be patient with it loading in some areas. You'll notice here this is getting a little slow. When you zoom into an area, for example, I'm going to type in again Chicago. You'll notice that as soon as I zoom into that area, it will take a minute or two for that data to load. So again, you'll have to be patient as this loads and as you explore your region and then some other areas that I ask you to look at. All right, so that's your story map. The next thing that I do want you to look at, I'm going to ask you to look at what's called the racial dot map. And the racial dot map, unfortunately, is an incredibly dense data set. It's a little difficult to navigate, but it looks like this. And so again, there's very little navigational ideas here. You can add map labels, makes it a little easier to navigate. But what this map shows is it's literally every person in the United States according to the 2010 census and their race. And what that means is that we can look at an area, and I'm going to just for a moment, I'm going to add the map labels, and I'm going to go down and look at an area around Raleigh in North Carolina. So there's our Raleigh area right there, and I'm going to begin to zoom in on it. You'll notice you have your zoom tools here. And as we move in, what we're going to see in Raleigh, you have to be kind of zoom in, and the colors, again, dots here, literally indicate people. And what you will notice when you zoom in on Raleigh is that the color combinations in this city are rather pronounced, again, blue being the white population, red being Asian, and then black being the green populations. What you'll notice is that in Raleigh there are very strong breaks in terms of the ethnicities or race for areas, but in some areas you'll notice this is quite blended. There's quite a number of dots mixed together. And so we can look at this and literally see how segregation occurs across a landscape. So we're going to use those two maps to explore the question of race, ethnicity, and segregation in the United States. I'm going to ask you to be looking at your region, your hometown, and the nearest urban center, and we're going to look at how things differ between the two of them. So that's it for lectures for Module 3. Make sure that you read the chapter before you take the quiz, and please complete the quick write assignment and put it in the Module 3 Dropbox.